Hello. So, obviously, Chuck from Death needs no introduction. Even the folks out there who might not like any death material can recognize the huge impact Chuck had on death metal. And nowadays, you see a lot of people kind of downplaying the influence of Chuck in some ways. A lot of people out there think Chuck kind of forfeited his underground street cred by going technical in the 90s. And I've noticed a sort of stark divide between the people who dig the early death material and the people who might prefer from spiritual healing or human onward, which, that's fine, of course. I mean, full disclosure, I'm not a death fanboy. They were an early death metal gateway for me as a kid, but I think there's bands that did the no frills, heavy, thrashy shit better. And I think there are bands that did the technical, proggy style better than death as well. But I still, honestly, I enjoy their entire discography, man. I mean, for different reasons. I, if I'm wanting something really brutal, I'm not going to pull out, Sound of Perseverance or Symbolic. But, I don't know. I think they've got good songs. I think every Death record has some good songs on it. I think my favorite's probably fucking Spiritual Healing. I think that's the best, kind of like the bridge between the early era and the later era. It's kind of like the best of both worlds for me. But I also, I love Human as well, which I know a lot of people on YouTube don't like it for some reason. But there's a common line of thinking nowadays that people just kind of hopped on the death bandwagon after Chuck died. Obviously, you know, I'm not, I'll be honest, I'm not 55, 56 years old. A lot of the older death metal guys like King Fowley, Martin Van Drunen, Dawn of the Dead, Barney from Napalm, all those dudes have kind of spoken about only digging the 80s death material and in some cases only digging the fucking demos. So the purpose of this video is to kind of take a look at some oddities in the underground death metal world who are essentially ripping off death before it was even cool to do it. I mean, nowadays, most bands of, 20-year-olds to 30-year-olds, they'll tell you something like, oh man, individual thought patterns changed my life when I found it on YouTube or something like that. But this list is focusing on bands in the 90s that were ripping off death, basically. That's what it is. This isn't necessarily a hidden gems list, although I do enjoy all the records on here. None of them reinvent the wheel or anything, but just from a cultural perspective, sociological perspective, man, I've always been fascinated by the idea of the worship band. That's something that seems almost unique to metal. The proud worship band, the band that sets out, whether inadvertently or not, to create music in the spirit of something that came before. And in the case of Death, it's interesting to see the bands who are proudly carrying on in its lineage, in Chuck's lineage, during a time when albums like Human and Symbolic were really, quite polarizing and not necessarily the undisputed classics that the audience of today might see them as. So, starting off this list is Polluted Inheritance from Holland. Now, it might offend a few people out there to lump them in this list of death worship bands, but I'll admit they're not strictly influenced by death, especially on their second album, Betrayed. You hear more Morbid Angel and stuff like that moving in, but their 1992 debut, Ecocide, I don't know. It's basically Holland's answer to Death's Human, although it's not nearly as good. No matter what people on the internet may tell you. You can also hear a bit of Pestilence, Testimony of the Ancients in there as well, but the human influence is very apparent. So that's an example of a young death metal band at the time who were clearly going for that style before it was the hottest thing. Up next is Burial. Now there's no shortage of death metal bands named Burial, but this is about the Netherlands Burial and their 1993 album Relinquished Souls. Now, whereas the last album on this list was clearly emulating the more technical, progressive side of death, This one's interesting because it's essentially a tribute to the Scream Bloody Gore era of death. Now, if a band comes out today doing that sort of thing, no one gives a fuck. You know, it's not really interesting or noteworthy at all to do that shit now. But for some reason, it's kind of fascinating to me that in 1993, only 6 years after Scream Bloody Gore came out, you had a band in the Netherlands, of all places, engaging in this kind of blatant throwback material. Now, the production of the album does give you some hints of the 90s there, but stylistically, when it comes down to the writing and the riffs and all that, this is textbook Scream Bloody Gore death, you know? Now, you saw this type of thrashy, old school 80s style death metal still coming out of, like South America around this same time. But for a place like the Netherlands, who were already well established in death metal, engaging in doom death, tech death, everything else, Burial's Relinquished Soul stands as like an interesting oddity. You know, a throwback album before throwback albums were like what you came to expect in death metal. You know, you gotta understand, in 1993, like, not every album you heard was like cavernous, $20 spin, incantation worship, for the 50,000th fucking time, So, it's pretty interesting stuff. Last on the list, I'm going to cover, I'm probably going to say this wrong, Tempestas from Brazil with 1995's Euphony of Contradictions. A lot of people who are absolute maniacs for the individual thought pattern, symbolic air of death, consider this one a hidden gem. I think it's definitely hidden. It's pretty good. It's enjoyable, but goddamn it, it's straight up 90s death worship. If I played this to you without any context, you'd probably just think it was like, death. Uh, there are some distinguishing characteristics, like the piano interludes and shit like that, but overall it's just textbook, man. Textbook death worship. Still, if you're a fan of the style, definitely track it down on YouTube if you just can't get enough of that sort of thing. I mean, it's just interesting that a band in the mid 90s in Brazil, of all places, was doing straight up individual thought pattern, symbolic type death material. So there you have it. 3 albums from the 90s that absolutely worship at the altar of Chuck. I wouldn't call any of these essential or must hear or anything, but they are 3 albums that take obvious, blatant inspiration from the musical areas that Chuck was already exploring in Death. So what do you guys think? Can you guys think of some more Death clones from before Chuck died? I know you can think of, Death clones after Chuck died. Let us know in the comments and subscribe.